Hello, everyone. As Kari said, my name is Megan, and today I'll be talking about how approachability is shaping accessible design at Us2 Games. So I'm just going to go over a little talk outline to talk about what I'm going to be sharing in this presentation. So I'm going to cover how accessibility is different from approachability. I'm going to look at the sort of design philosophy at Us2 Games and how that has made approachable games. And then I'm going to talk about how those approachable games have influenced accessibility at Us2. And then at the end, I'll wrap up some key takeaways for you all. So a little introduction of who I am. I'm a multidisciplinary game designer at Us2 Games. We're a very small studio, so designers touch a lot of different things on their games. But I really specialize recently more in accessibility. And this is because I'm disabled and neurodivergent, and it's become sort of a very personal interest of mine. So over the last couple of years, I've learned a lot more about accessibility. And in our most recent title, Monument Valley 3, I did a lot of accessibility reports and included a lot more accessibility options as sort of my specialist area while working on that game. So just as a brief overview, because I'm going to be talking a lot about Monument Valley 3 in this talk. If you've never played it before, Monument Valley 3 is the third installment of a series of puzzle games that are on mobile. They're highly visual and audio-filled experiences with friendly puzzle solving at their core. They focus on low-text storytelling and these mind-bending visual illusions. And they are all originally designed for touchscreens. So most of the things I'll be talking about today are based upon mobile touch input. So if you hear me say tap or touch or swipe or anything like that, I'm talking about mobile devices. First, I'm going to go over the difference between accessibility and approachability, because it's very important to be aware that they're two different things. Making your game accessible means that you're taking steps to make your game playable by players with disabilities. Whereas making an approachable game means you're taking steps to make your game playable by newcomers to your game. So that could be anyone who's never picked up a device before, or somebody who's never played a video game before, or has really little to no interaction with that type of thing. It's important to know the difference between the two because I'm going to be talking about both throughout this talk. And I want to ensure that you know that they're not the same thing. So when I sat down to work on Monument Valley 3 sort of 2 years ago, one of the first things I did was I wrote an accessibility report based on the first two games, so Monument Valley 1 and 2. And I realized something very quickly, that we actually had quite a lot of accessible features in our games, even though accessibility hadn't even been thought about before. And I wondered why that happened, because obviously if you've got accessibility features but not even thought about it, where did that come from? And one of the things I realized is that Us2 had made pillars for their games that were related to approachability. And you can see with our previous title, Desta, I've got the pillars up here. And one of the things we wanted to do with Desta was make a tactics game that was easy for players who have never approached that genre before to be able to play. So things like easy to understand numbers, tactile board game feel, no hidden information on the board, and these sort of playful interactions. So you don't really have to understand the tactics genre itself. And then the same with Monument Valley 1 and 2. The pillars we had for those were with the story, you show, you don't tell. So there's no text, there's very low text in the game. It's very simple, readable and printable screens. So everything's very high contrast. So it could be printed as a poster. Flow, not frustration, again, with tactile input of the game. And really what they wanted to do with Monument Valley 1 and 2 when they first made those games was make sure that they're playable by anyone. And this is something that's been at the heart of Us2 Games for a very long time. On the slide here, there's a collage of images of various different people of lots of ages playing Monument Valley, or even playing with toys that relate to Monument Valley. And the central image is one that I really think about a lot, which is this whole family gathered around an iPad with their grandma playing at the center. But really, Us2 have been trying to test with literally anyone and everyone that they can to make sure that their game is approachable in that way. And it sort of accidentally created this curb cut effect. which you saw in the last presentation was very handy. But basically, essentially what curb cut effect is they've dropped the curbs so that wheelchair users have access to pavements. But it also made it more accessible for people who, for example, are riding a bike or riding roller skates or any of those sorts of things. And with us too, because we'd been sort of playtesting with a whole variety of people, we'd accidentally created this sort of reverse curb cut effect where we'd made a lot of things accessible without even really knowing that we were doing it. We just playtested a lot, found a lot of problems and fixed them. And it's basically what I'm going to be talking about now is some instances where that's happened and some like more specific instances of where maybe we found something through playtesting and we fixed it, and sort of show you in action how that can be done. So one of the first things I noticed when working on Monument Valley, looking at the first two games, was a design decision had been made where we'd watch a lot of play testers play the game and struggle to accurately select things on the screen, because at the time, mobile screens were very small and it is very difficult to accurately select tiny things on the screen. So one of the things that was changed was that in anything interactable on the screen that used to have a small hitbox, which is this thing on the top, this tiny green box around the interactable, were then enlarged to make these sort of slightly larger green boxes, so you don't have to be quite as accurate to select things in the game. And it's like that throughout the whole game. And then one of the other things that I noticed was because the game is quite highly like tactile feel, a lot of the interactions have both visual and audio feedback. So when you tap anything in the game, it makes a noise. But when you select anything in the game as well, it glows or it gives you this visual or feel of feedback. So for example, the draggable handles in our game all light up when they're touched, but they also make a distinct noise. And then whenever you tap on the floor to move your character, there's a distinct circle visual, but then there's also this distinct pinging noise that you hear every time you tap on the floor. So you kind of can almost feel your way around a level in an audio sense and kind of understand where different things are depending on what different noises they make. One last example of like where Monument Valley 1 and 2 made a approachable decision is the artists and designers came up with this idea that the characters would always be one color in the scene, and all the backgrounds and levels had to work around that. So essentially, we always come up with what the character is going to look like first, and then all the levels have to contrast against that character. So for example, in Monument Valley 1, the character was actually made to be purely white with a sort of like black outline. And this meant that a lot of the backgrounds of the levels in Monument Valley 1 were actually like black or of a darker color. So there's a high contrast between the two. And this is because in playtesting, they found that people couldn't find the character on the screen. And they wanted to make that more visual so that it's easier to see them. But one of the things I want to touch on is where, although this approachability thing has allowed us to create more accessible games already, there was definitely some areas that were missed with this method. And I wanted to show a couple of examples of where we might have found like some approachable solutions, but we definitely missed a few areas of accessibility on Monument Valley 3. So the first one is there's an image on the screen of two screenshots. And the first image is from Monument Valley 1. And there's sort of like a cube style puzzle level. And there's two sides of the cube that are differentiated by color. And we use this as puzzle designers to try and reduce cognitive load for players so they don't have to remember so much of what's going on in the level, especially if there's a lot of things going on. But as some of you might have realized, differentiating by color, obviously for some people who can't differentiate two colors, it's not giving them the information that other people are having. So it's giving them a disadvantage. Whereas in Monument Valley 3, we made a conscious effort to use patterns on the floor instead. So for example, the screenshot on the right, it shows doors that are linked via shapes. So in front of the door, there's a circle. And if you enter that door, it will take you to the other door that has a circle below it. And it's something very subtle, but it really does reduce cognitive load for players who are looking for that type of thing or maybe struggling with the level itself. Another example I've got, this is probably a very boring slide because there's a lot of post-it notes, but with Monument Valley 3, we noticed for the first time that players were struggling with very bright or visually disturbing screens. And one of the things we had to do was kind of divide that into, well, what are players actually struggling with? And we found two areas where bright screens were affecting players. And one of those that we were able to solve was we were screen fading between levels to white. So it was going from like a dark screen to a white screen back to a dark screen. And it was causing this like visual flash in people's eyes that we weren't intending to happen. But because we got that feedback, we were able to solve that problem and use a more toned down color. And then there was another issue with like screens that are bright for a very long time. And because we're a small team, it's not something we could really solve at the time. Once you've got all the art in a game that's very bespoke, you can't really undo it, unfortunately. But it's definitely something we thought about, created an idea of having a toggleable filter for, but we didn't get the time to put it in the game itself. But it's important to acknowledge the fact that we're aware of it, but we couldn't do anything at the time because it's something you could pick back up later on. And then the third and final example I'm going to give of some of the things in Monument Valley 3 that we introduced that weren't in the first two games were in the games themselves, there's a lot of camera shake. Because we're doing show, don't tell as storytelling, a lot of the time when something bad happens in the world, the whole camera shakes and everything falls apart. But we realized this was causing people a lot of motion sickness, especially now screens on phones have got bigger. So it's now a toggleable filter in the settings that you can turn off. And then the same thing with pinch to zoom, so gesture controls. We found that a lot of people were accidentally interacting with gesture controls when they didn't want to be. So it's now a toggleable setting in the settings of Monument Valley 3. I'm going to go over some of the key takeaways of these slides. The first thing I think that is kind of might be useful for smaller studios is that approachability may be a really useful pillar for smaller studios to think about in terms of accessibility, because you're instilling an ethos across your team to be aware of decisions and designs that are being created. So you're kind of building something from the ground up. If you're always thinking about, can everyone play this? Then you're always going to test to make sure that everyone can play it. And then the second thing, which sort of leads on from that, is testing with an audience broader than your intended or focused one. Us two always like tests with the most broadest audience they possibly can. So we'll get gamers who have played hours and hours of games, but we'll get like your grandparents who maybe have never even picked up a game before to like interact with it and see where they struggle. And it's one of those things that's really helped us spot barriers over time, even though we're not necessarily looking for accessibility barriers, we're just seeing them because we're automatically finding this broad range of people. And then the third and final point I think is really important to understand, especially in a smaller team, is that it's really good to acknowledge your wins in accessibility, understand where you can improve, but also accept that you can't do everything. I think one of the things that tripped us up very early on is that we had this really long list of things we'd love to include in the game, but we just don't have the resources, the time, the money, any of that to do it. So trying to understand where we can get those wins and where we can improve for next time was a big thing for us that kind of will carry on into projects even further down the line. And yeah, I made this meme, which is the two really buff guys having a handshake in the middle. And I really do think that in this case, especially at us two games, there's a crossover where approachability and accessibility are really coming together here to create this inclusive design. And it's kind of a unique case where, especially because the studios come from like a graphic design background before they became a game studio, they're kind of thinking about all users rather than just single users. So I think this meme sums it up very well. But that's it from me. I'm finishing early, but thank you very much for listening. You can find me on any of the socials up here or on the slides later. But thank you very much.